Okay, so I want you to picture a standard African Union summit. If you follow politics on the continent, you definitely know the vibe.
Oh, yeah. It's usually a pretty noisy affair.
Very noisy. You get the grand speeches, the debates in the corridors, these long, long declarations read out to the press.
And it's a place where consensus is, well, it's broadcast at high volume, especially when a member state feels its sovereignty is being threatened.
That's the whole point, right? To present a unified vocal front on borders, on territorial integrity.
Exactly. It's a mechanism for collective amplification.
But today, we're looking at a recent summit that was notable for the exact opposite reason. We aren't analyzing a speech or a treaty or even a handshake. We are analyzing a silence.
Specifically, the silence that followed a major diplomatic move in the Horn of Africa.
And in diplomacy, silence isn't just an absence of noise, is it?
Not at all. It's a policy position, and sometimes it's a very, very loud one.
So we're doing a deep dive into an analysis titled Somaliland Won This Diplomatic Round. And the silence speaks volumes. It really breaks down the fallout, or I guess the strange lack of fallout, after Israel's move to recognize Somaliland.
And this is a scenario that, on paper at least, should have triggered a diplomatic earthquake.
For sure.
I mean, you have a non-AU member recognizing a breakaway region of a member state. The script for this is usually written in stone, but this time
That script got thrown out.
it did.
So our mission today is to figure out why. We need to decode that silence and really understand how a non-event at the AU might actually signal this massive shift in how the continent is handling the Horn of Africa.
It's not just about maps. It's about what happens when 30 years of, facts on the ground finally collide with diplomatic tradition.
A case of realism versus ritual.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so let's set the stage. Most of our listeners know the basic Somaliland context. It's been operating as a de facto independent state for, over 3 decades now?
Over 30 years, yeah, while legally still being seen as part of Somalia. But the catalyst here, the thing that kicked this all off, was Israel's recent recognition.
Right, and Somalia, historically, has always played the continental solidarity card whenever this happens.
They do. They go straight to the AU. They invoke the Charter on the sanctity of colonial borders, and they ask for a collective condemnation. It's been their playbook for years.
And historically, it works. It's almost a reflex action for the AU. Protect the member state.
It's been the standard operating procedure. You circle the wagons. So the expectation in Mogadishu, and frankly in a lot of diplomatic circles, was that this summit would produce a swift, unequivocal rebuke of Israel.
The logic being, if you let one border be questioned, you question them all.
Precisely.
But, and this is the entire core of the analysis we're looking at, that rebuke, it just never happened.
It didn't. The summit happened, delegates met, they all went home. And there was no collective finger-wagging at Israel, no unified statement shutting Somaliland down.
It was a complete non-event.
And the source argues that this non-event is in itself a victory for Hargeisa, for Somaliland's capital. You have to see it as diplomatic signaling.
It's not like they just forgot to put it on the agenda.
Not a chance. Omitting a condemnation in a situation this high stakes, that's a deliberate choice. It tells you that the consensus needed to issue that statement, it just wasn't there.
So we have to ask why. I mean, the AU is usually terrified of secessionist movements. Avoiding fragmentation is like rule number 1. Why would they break the pattern now?
Well, this is where we get into that tension between what the source calls inherited positions and just simple realism. The analysis suggests we are hitting a tipping point.
A tipping point where member states are starting to weigh the reality they see with their own eyes over the legal theory they've always been told to uphold.
Exactly. And when you say reality, we have to be specific here. We aren't just talking about some rebel group holding a bit of territory.
No, this is an institutional reality.
It is. Somaliland has had its own functioning government for over 30 years. They hold elections, credible elections. They have a security apparatus, a currency, their own passports.
30 years is an entire generation. An entire generation that has grown up knowing nothing else.
And that's the key. You can pretend a breakaway region doesn't exist for 5 years, maybe 10. But after 30 years of it being, relatively stable, pretending it isn't there starts to damage your own credibility.
The cognitive dissonance just becomes too much.
It becomes too heavy to carry. So for a lot of diplomats, this reflexive adherence to the old map is getting harder and harder to justify against the stability they can plainly see on the ground.
But doesn't that open a kind of Pandora's box?
Right.
If the AAU admits that, time plus stability equals legitimacy, aren't they worried about other regions saying, hey, what about us?
That is always the fear, of course. But the silence suggests that maybe, just maybe, they're treating this as a unique case. Somaliland's history is different. It was a separate British protectorate that chose to merge and then dissolve that union. That, combined with this 30-year track record,
It puts it in a different category.
it does. And the silence implies that AE members are quietly acknowledging that, look, this situation isn't just going to go away.
So the old strategy of ignore it until it fails has officially expired.
It seems so, yes.
Now, politics abhors a vacuum. So the AU stayed silent, but Somalia obviously couldn't. The source we're looking at highlights the reaction from the Somali president, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed.
Right. He gave an interview to Sharq al-Assad, and the tone was, well, it was very telling.
He warned about narrow, short-term interests being pursued by regional actors. He framed it as a threat to stability.
Which is pretty standard language. It's code for, you're selling us out for your own gain.
Exactly. But what's really fascinating is what he didn't say. The source points out he didn't name names. He just kept referring to unnamed regional actors.
That seems counterintuitive, right? If you feel your neighbors are stabbing you in the back, why not call them out? Shame them publicly.
Well, you only do that if you're sure you can win the fight that follows. In diplomacy, vague accusations like that are often a sign of limited leverage.
So if he had the full fiery backing of the entire continent,
He would have been naming countries and reading the Riot Act, but he didn't. The vagueness is a defensive crouch.
a measured response because he knows the ground is shifting beneath his feet. If he pushes too hard and gets no backup, it just exposes his own isolation even more.
It sounds like he's trying to hold the line, but he's realizing he might be holding it alone.
I think he's realizing that the automatic alignment he used to be able to rely on is just gone. The source says his rhetoric isn't a projection of strength. It's a reflection of his deep concern about these shifting calculations.
So let's dig into those calculations. Because nations don't just change 30 years of policy on a whim. The analysis points to three specific dynamics behind this silence. The first is a reassessment of partnerships.
Right. You have to look at this transactionally. For a long time, supporting Somalia's territorial integrity was an easy yes for African nations. It cost them nothing, earned them solidarity points. But now,
The calculus has changed.
it really has. States are acting out of pure self-interest. They're looking at the Horn of Africa and asking, okay, who can actually deliver on security? Who offers real trade potential? And Somaliland has a long coastline on the Red Sea. They have a stable port in Berbera. Somalia, meanwhile, is still struggling deeply with al-Shabaab.
So it's a cold, hard look at the return on investment. And backing the status quo just doesn't pay the dividends it used to.
Not anymore. And that ties right into the second factor, which is the elephant in the room, the Israel factor.
The move that triggered this whole thing. Why does Israel's involvement make African states go quiet? You'd think for some members that might be controversial.
It is controversial for some, but Israel has spent the last decade aggressively building ties across Africa. We're talking about agri-tech, security cooperation, water management.
They have powerful friends on the continent now.
Powerful friends. So if a country comes out swinging against Israel over Somaliland, they risk damaging their own bilateral relationship.
And for what? Why pick that fight?
Exactly. Why pick a fight with a strategic partner over a border dispute that doesn't really affect you? The source suggests the cost of condemning Israel now outweighs the benefit of pleasing Somalia. It's pure, realpolitik.
And then there's the third dynamic, just plain stability. The Horn of Africa is, well, it's a mess right now.
It's incredibly volatile. You've got the civil war in Sudan, tensions in Ethiopia, the constant issues in Somalia itself. And in that context, Somaliland is an outlier.
It's boringly stable.
And boringly stable is the highest compliment you can get in that neighborhood.
It really is.
So many African capitals now view Somaliland as a functional security partner. They control their borders, they manage their post. In a region overflowing with weapons and refugees, nobody wants to destabilize the one actor that seems to have its house in order.
So the silence at the summit wasn't just about ignoring Somaliland. It was about not wanting to break it.
That's a perfect way to put it. Condemning them or isolating them could undermine that stability. And right now, the AU values stability over almost anything else. They do not want another crisis.
But we should be careful here. The analysis makes a point to say this is not the AU granting full recognition.
No, absolutely not. We shouldn't overstate it. We're not going to see the Somaliland flag raised as the 56th member next week.
Right.
But the victory here lies in the fact that Somaliland's case is no longer being dismissed outright. It's moved from a closed door to an open question.
It's the difference between a hard no and a no comment, which, in diplomacy, is massive.
It's huge. And the source really credits Somaliland's own strategy for this. They call it patient and incremental.
The long game.
It is. They didn't try to force this with flashy moves. They focused on the boring stuff. Building institutions, holding elections, securing their port. They prioritized internal legitimacy over external validation.
Which is so interesting because usually these kinds of movements are obsessed with external validation. They want the big photo op at the UN.
Somaliland flipped the script. They decided to act like a state first and just wait for the world to catch up. And that has normalized the discussion. It's reduced the stigma. 10 years ago, a diplomat meeting with a Somaliland official was a scandal. Now, it's just business.
They made themselves undeniable.
They did. And that brings us to the philosophical core of this whole situation. The analysis frames it as a clash of narratives, the law versus the life.
I loved that framing. Break that down for us.
Okay, so Somalia's argument is based on legal continuity. They say, we are the sovereign state, these are the borders we inherited, and under international law, that is final. And, legally, they have a point. That's the standard interpretation.
The rigid black-letter law approach.
Exactly. But Somaliland's argument is based on what they call lived political reality. They say, look, we have been self-governing for 33 years. We have peace. We have the consent of the governed. That is the life argument.
And the tension is that as more time passes, the life argument gets heavier, and the law argument starts to feel lighter.
That's precisely what's happening. Rhetoric alone can't bridge that gap forever. You can stand at a podium and shout about territorial integrity, but if you haven't provided services or security or governance to that territory in 3 decades, your claim starts to feel a bit theoretical.
And the AU's silence is basically an admission that the gap between the map and the territory has become too wide to just ignore anymore.
It is, and it puts Somalia in a terrible bind. Because the diplomatic insulation they always relied on, the idea that the AAU would always back the law, is evaporating.
It's gone.
They now have to actually compete for influence over a territory they claim to own. They can't just demand loyalty. They have to offer something better than what Hargeisa is offering. And right now, that's a very tough sell.
This all just challenges the popular view of diplomacy, doesn't it? We think of big showdowns, ultimatums.
Banging shoes on the table.
Right. But this story suggests the real shifts, the big ones, happen when nothing is said at all.
Real diplomatic battles are rarely won with fireworks. They're won with positioning, endurance, and restraint. Somaliland didn't need a parade from the AU. They didn't need a resolution in their favor.
They just needed to not get crushed.
They needed to survive the pressure. The source has this great line. In diplomacy, survival under pressure is often the first sign of victory. By weathering this storm without the AU collapsing on top of them, they proved they are strong enough to stand on their own.
They've moved from being dismissed to being debated.
And that's the whole game. If people are arguing about you, or even just hesitating to condemn you, it means you're a player on the board. You are no longer just a pawn.
So let's take a step back. For the listener who might not be tracking the Horn of Africa every day, why does this specific silence matter to them? What's the bigger lesson here?
Well, it connects to how we understand change in the international system. We're always looking for the loud signals, invasions, treaties, revolutions. But the geopolitical tectonic plates, they usually shift silently, long before the earthquake actually hits.
It's about learning to read the non-events.
It is. If you want to know where the world is going, look at who is not complaining. Look at which alliances aren't being reaffirmed. That silence tells you where the real interests lie.
In this case, it tells us the AU is becoming more pragmatic and maybe a little less ideological.
And that has huge implications for everything from trade to future borders across the continent.
It's a sobering thought. The status quo feels permanent right up until the moment you realize everyone has quietly stopped defending it.
And that's where we are. The defense of the old order has gone quiet.
Which brings us to the final thought I want to leave everyone with. The source ends on a bit of a cliffhanger. If the status quo is no longer automatic and the silence has already started, what happens when that silence eventually breaks?
Because it won't stay quiet forever. Eventually, that reality on the ground will force a decision.
And if this summit is any indication, that decision might not look anything like the maps we have hanging on our walls right now.
It is a brave new world.
It certainly is. Thanks for walking us through the quietest and maybe the loudest event of the year.
My pleasure. Always great to dig in.
And to our listeners, thanks for being here. Keep listening, especially to what isn't being said. We'll see you on the next deep dive.